The project, which is the Global Health Solidarity, but its actual name is Moving Beyond Solidarity Rhetoric, is a 5-year Wellcome Trust funded project. It's a Discovery Award. And the goal is to shift understandings and the practice of solidarity in global health. We believe that this can play, or solidarity can play, a more active role in increasing equity and justice. So how do we go about this? We have 3 key phases. Phase 1 is identifying the different understandings of solidarity. We've done this work since we started in 2022 until October 2025 last year, when we finished our discovery phase of how people understand solidarity and practice it in different contexts. So now we're in phase 2, and phase 2 looks at generating a shared set of core goals to guide the practice of solidarity. And in this phase 2, the first output we've had is now the principles which we have brought today. And as we'll hear from the talk later, we will see and have a discussion how this evolved into solidarity principles using the different findings we got from phase 1. And then we'll have phase 3, which will come directly from this discussion of the activities of phase 2, where we look to co-create tools or metrics that are likely to guide the practice of solidarity through measuring and operationalizing how we take steps towards being solidaristic. And now our global reaching activities, mainly we have implementing partners in the different parts of the world, as we can see with the red circles and dots in the middle. These are our implementing partners or partner institutions. And these institutions have been very key in coordinating activities across the years, and we're still working together throughout. So one of the activities I would call for attention to the orange circles was organizing regional workshops where we've had different actors, including marginalized populations, indigenous populations, and other experts which are not normally consulted or even attending such gatherings like today, talk to us about solidarity. And then we had empirical research where we did interviews. As you can see, the people icons on the map. These are the 41 countries that were represented in the interviews, with also different actors at different categories and levels. The Convivial Workshop is one that has been recently concluded. Early this year in February, it happened in South Africa. And this was a major workshop where we discussed the first draft of the propositions, and now called principles. So I will not preempt the discussion that is to follow from our project lead, Cesar. So I will first stop here and now introduce and welcome Cesar, who is our project lead. For those of you who do not know Cesar as well, he is the co-director of Oxford Global Health. He is the president of International Association of Bioethics. He is a philosopher. I wear many hats, Cesar. I cannot exhaust everything, but I welcome you to take us through this presentation that we've been waiting for, the principles today. And after that, you can take over still and introduce our guest speakers and moderate the discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm so excited. I can see that we have over 150 people. And from the chat, you can see that people come from Thailand through to Canada and South Africa and many other countries. This is really great, and it shows the importance of thinking around solidarity in global health. So I will share the slides and begin to explain what we have been doing to generate these principles and what the principles represent. And then after that, I will introduce the speakers and we can then have their input. We're talking about global health, but I think it's important for us to contextualize where we are at the moment. One can say that the notion of global health, it's generally contested sometimes. I mean, we do not have, a unified and agreed definition of what global health is, but at least global health has presented itself as something that is trying to promote greater equity for everyone all over the world in issues regarding health. But this reality that we call global health, this space, today we can say it's under attack. So, I mean, it's under attack from various, angles. Multilateralism is suffering many attacks. Funding is reduced. And yet, at the same time, we notice that in times of crisis, there are always calls for solidarity. But what do we really mean? And especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, we all noticed that, yes, whereas communities, small groups showed solidarity towards each other, people helping somebody who is sick by actually going to do shopping for them or trying to assist. On the international level, a lot of solidarity was spoken about, but in reality, little was achieved. So much so that, countries were busy receiving booster vaccine doses while others were struggling to get their first dose. Now, this situation that made the concept of solidarity in global health enter into, crisis or even questioning has actually been exacerbated by the current cuts in funding, withdrawals from multilateralism, and it is generating a climate whereby nationalisms are beginning to become strong, and international collaboration seems to be weaker. And if anything at all, countries seem to be going more for bilateral collaborations. Amidst all this, there were the negotiations for the pandemic agreement, which ended in 2025. And if you read through this pandemic agreement, you will see that solidarity, or the principle of solidarity, was actually encoded in the pandemic agreement. Now, the question becomes, how does this idea of solidarity, which is often invoked, it is now in the pandemic agreement, how do we actually pass from the rhetoric to real practice? And what we've been doing, as Julian presented, is trying to understand what people think and expect of solidarity in different parts of the world. Above all, putting our ear to the ground to listen to people on the ground, not so much, trying to listen only from the top. And through this, we came up with some themes from the interviews, from the workshops, and those themes were developed into propositions. And with these propositions, we met in Cape Town, in Johannesburg in February, invited external stakeholders as well as our own team members, and we discussed these propositions. And out of these propositions have emerged the principles that we'll be sharing today. Now, just to say something about the principles, we've decided to focus the action of the principles above all on the funding ecosystem, because a lot of global health research, global health implementation programs are usually centered and driven by funding. And if we are able to introduce the idea or embed the idea of solidarity within that ecosystem, then we'll be able to influence and perhaps shift our understanding and practices of solidarity. So we're talking about researchers, implementers, funders, government, civil society organizations at the micro level, at the meso level, sort of like national levels, and then at the international level, which we call the macro level. The goal is to say this. We accept and we recognize that many organizations, by definition, are not solidaristic. If you take a philanthropic organization that wants to do humanitarian aid, perhaps solidarity is not their main goal. Or if you take a government that decides to use international aid within the health space, global health space, their goals may not be solidarity. Their identity may not be solidaristic. But what we can insist is that if global health is about people coming together, to stand together, to fight disease, to fight illness, then that is a solidaristic space, and anybody, irrespective of their identity, who wants to operate in this space must comply with solidaristic ideals. Now, the principles as we have them here are not a sort of checklist. These are evolving standards of practice that need constant negotiation. And these are the ones that I'll be presenting shortly. Now, how do we use these principles? They are prompts for reflections for organizations, for different stakeholders, to ask ourselves, like, what we're trying to do, how does it reflect the ideas of solidarity? Or are we simply engaging all forms of extractivism or even forms of just like charity, which is about the powerful helping the less powerful, and therefore they are premised on power differentials? The principles will also serve as a catalyst for dialogue to continue to interrogate ourselves as we work in this space to see how we are performing. They can be normative reference points for structuring funding arrangements and research partnerships, and then to become a foundation for us to develop tools that actors can really use in their day-to-day activities. So what are these principles? These principles that we've identified are 9. We call them the 333 framework. And they are structured around what is solidarity, how is it practiced, and to what end. So when we think about what is solidarity, we just, even though there is no unique, generally agreed definition of solidarity, what we did with these principles was to look at the traits that were common in the different conceptualizations in order to emerge with these principles. And so what we're talking about in solidarity is action. Solidarity is not just about saying or feeling. It is about doing something, or at least stopping to do it. And it is standing with and for others. And this standing with is based on identifying with them, identifying or with their plight or with the joy that they are celebrating. And therefore, it is not premised on the difference, which sometimes charity does. And it is a specific type of relationship that involves caring. And it is practiced through mutuality. That is the how. Mutuality is not the same thing as a reciprocity or do ut des, I give so that you give back. But it is because we are together, we're fighting for an ideal or an aspiration or a goal. And for that matter, it is built on trust that everybody will do their part. And it also means that you just don't sort of like wake up one day and say, well, I'm out. And second, and finally, in the how, we have solidarity requires respectful and inclusive engagement, because when we engage in solidarity, we all bring in what we can contribute in order to further the cause that we're standing with. And it does not mean that somebody who brings more of one particular aspect certainly takes the lion's share, because the goal is to achieve something that will be shared for among all of us. And the end of all this activity in solidarity, one, at least it challenges the power differentials in global health. It pursues emancipatory ends. And emancipatory here, I mean, emancipare, and from the Latin, it means the hand that is holding some people down, we need to take off that hand so that people can flourish. And solidarity, therefore, is key in the pursuit of health, equity, and fairness, which are the core aspirations of global health. I'll stop here just briefly, because we'll hear more about these principles, and then move to the next section of the webinar, which is my goal here, or my job here, is to introduce our speakers. We are really fortunate to have with us a very highly qualified group of speakers who will be leading us through. The first speaker will be Michelle Childs. She's the Policy Advocacy Director at the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDi. Michelle has a lot of experience in the field of civil society, global health, medicines for diseases, neglected diseases. She has asked me not to be very long in presenting her, so I will not go further. I will not go far. But we're really delighted to have you here with us. We'll have Professor Madhukar, who is the Canada Research Chair in Epidemiology and Global Health at McGill University. And he's also Director of Global Health Programs and Director of the International TB Center. Madhu is well known for his extensive writing and even training programs that are linked to issues around justice, equity, decolonization, and other fairness issues in global health. And we're really delighted to have him here with us. The third speaker is Julia Kemp, and she's the Associate Director for Equitable Research Ecosystems at Wellcome Trust. She leads a team responsible for Wellcome Trust major research international partnerships across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, with a focus on equity, inclusion, and ensuring that communities are placed at the center of health research. Julia comes with a baggage of experience in international development as well, and I think her contribution would help us to really make sense of these principles and what solidarity can do in global health. And finally, we have Dr. Benjamin Djoudalbaye, who is from the Africa CDC. He's head of policy, health diplomacy, and communication. And prior to joining the Africa CDC, he was senior health officer for HIV, TB, malaria, and other infectious diseases at the African Union Commission for more than 8 years. And he has a wealth of experience. So we will be hearing him also speak to us from the perspective of the Africa CDC. I think I'll hand over to Michelle to start us off with. And I'm asking Michelle to speak first because DNDi, Drugs for Neglected Diseases, that Michelle represents, is an organization that has solidarity within the core motivations of their activity. So looking at the principles that we're trying to generate and the practice that, you have been involved in, Michelle, over years, if you could throw light on this, I think that would be great. Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to speak, and congratulations on the principles. I think they're really helpful. I think, as you said, global health is becoming more transactional, and I think the emphasis is on more. It always has been to an extent transactional, and I think the risk is that equity becomes negotiable and solidarity becomes optional. And so I think the question is, what can we do to make solidarity more embedded in a difficult system? And I think from DNDi's perspective, and we're a not-for-profit medical R&D organization who works with partners to develop new treatments for diseases of poverty and for people who are vulnerable and marginalized, and they're the people that we stand with. I think solidarity is both a value that we are seeking in a small way to try to address that injustice, which means that health tools are either unavailable or unaffordable or just not fit for the circumstances in which people live. But it's importantly, I think, also a practice that we put in place approaches that try to address that. And I think, if we're talking about research and development, it's a knowledge-based approach. And I think solidarity for us also means that we treat knowledge and health tools as public goods or a commons. And it means that this knowledge and the life-saving medical tools that are created are something that we should steward together, because people depend on them, not as assets which we hold back or trade for leverage. And I think that, when you talk about an organization, I think solidarity isn't mainly about institutional design. I think, important as that can be, I think it shows up most clearly in how problems are defined, how partnerships are built, whose experiences shapes decisions, how knowledge is generated and shared, and how we stay accountable when things get difficult. But I think rhetorical solidarity is cheap. Operational solidarity is hard. I think solidarity is fragile, and you can't rely just on goodwill. I think in our experience, and I think we have to come with some humility, we're not a perfect organization, we're still trying, but it does need structure. I think the type of structure, though, is key. The logic has been with DNDi from the beginning. We were founded by partners from different regions, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, Southeast Asia, and also clinicians, Doctors Without Borders. And it was around a common mission and vision to address this injustice, and a recognition that you couldn't solve neglected diseases through one geography and one organization. And I think that diversity anchors us in the global public interest, and it makes solidarity more durable because it's shared authority backed also by independent scientific advice. But I think that solidarity is a verb, it's not static. And I think it needs constant review. The world has changed a lot since we were set up over 20 years ago. I mean, for example, the Africa CDC didn't exist, and the epidemiological challenges, the circumstances in which the people that we are in solidarity with have changed. So I think it's really important to continue to review what solidarity means and to focus on what the problem is. And I think it's when we're talking about global health and institutions, very commonly people start to talk about the institutions themselves rather than the problem that people are trying to solve. And I think that's what we need to focus on. It's not feasible to have one institution or one organization capturing those functions. It's important also because organizations need to change, because otherwise you can stand in the way of solidarity in the growth of others. I think two other points that I'd make is that another place where solidarity becomes tangible is in how partnerships are organized, not just how institutions are governed. And I can give you a couple of examples here where we've tried to do this. I think first is in relation to dengue. And I think dengue is a good test because it exposes the limits of a purely transactional approach. It's spreading fast, driven by climate change. It's spreading beyond high burden countries. And despite its scale, there are still no approved antiviral treatments. And a transactional response tends to fragment the landscape. It isolates projects, it has short funding cycles, and it creates competitions between institutions. And I think what we tried to do with the Dengue Alliance is to set up something deliberately to do the opposite. I think it brings together research institutes and clinicians across dengue endemic countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and now we've had interest from Kenya to work toward a shared goal, which is to develop accessible dengue treatments. And I think what is important about it is how the partnership works and how decisions are taken. The priorities are agreed together, the choices are made by consensus, and the relevance and affordability is handled up front, not to be discussed later. And it's shared stewardess, less competition for credit, more shared responsibility for the outcomes. And I think it's interesting because dengue isn't just a regional issue. It's a signal of how interconnected public health risks are and why we need solidarity to overcome them. I think another place where solidarity becomes tangible is patient and community engagement. And I think too often in global health, we treat this as a tick box, as consultation. And I think solidarity asks for something much harder, which is ongoing influence and accountability. And at DNDi, we've sought to embed patient engagement across the R&D life cycle, starting from our board, but also in the priorities we set and how we set up trials and the results. But we realized we need to go further because we've tended just to talk to people about individual projects, but we're now setting up regional community advisory groups who can actually help us to define our strategy more broadly. And it's not just a one-off input, but to shape decisions over time. And I think solidarity is often seen as worthy, but it's really practical. You know, if you talk to people, the research becomes more relevant, ethical and operational issues surface earlier, and the relationship shifts from research on communities to working with them. And I think that shift is easy to say, it's harder to sustain, which is why we need structures that make it real. And I think the last thing is, you know, when we talked about COVID, I mean, clearly the scientific breakthroughs were at record speeds. I mean, the science worked, but we failed at solidarity. And I think that, you know, what we're seeking to do in a small way is to say, okay, well, if you were going to change things, what could you do? And we're trying to build a response for preparedness, which works across different regions, but builds in the development of new antivirals, which build in access from the start. But also we recognize the limits of our own power. And so we were advocating as part of the pandemic agreement that the rules of the game were changed and that governments themselves use their power and put conditions on public funding to ensure access. And that was eventually included in the pandemic agreement. So kind of what I'd like to finish on is, for me, it's not that whether solidarity is a nice idea. It's really that solidarity and the principles behind it is not about ignoring the constraints in the world that we're living in, but it's really helping to decide what do you not compromise on when things get tough. I think the real question is whether we can design systems that hold on to justice when it's inconvenient, when funding tightens, and when politics intrude. And that's why I think we need this principle as guardrails to say these things are non-negotiable. And we face those challenges ourselves when people are sort of coming and saying, follow the funding. But if that funding comes with strings that excludes some of the populations we want to serve, then we just can't accept it. And I think that solidarity principles shouldn't ignore complexity, but they should just make the trade-offs clearer. And the choices that you make have to be transparent and shared with the populations affected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was very powerful and really very helpful. I mean, I like the phrase about rhetorical solidarity is cheap and practical solidarity is hard. And I noticed in your presentation the idea of focusing more on people and on the relationships, yet at the same time, the need to have some form of institutional structure that can protect and pursue the ends of solidarity. And I think that's the tension of, when you institutionalize, do you hollow out in your institutionalizing? And at the same time, how can you have structures that can protect the individuals, especially the most vulnerable within these global health relationships? With that, I will hand over to Professor Pai. I think he's generally known as Madhu, right? If I'm not mistaken. We're really excited to hear you. Over to you.
Thank you, Cesar, and thanks everyone. Great to see all of you here. I have been using the word allyship more than the word solidarity. And I posted an article where we wrote a few years ago on why global North countries need to be better allies. But I don't think it matters whether we call it solidarity or allyship or something else. I think the principles that you have listed here are pretty solid. I see nothing challenging or difficult in it. But what I'm struggling with, and I hope we can have some honest conversations right now, is that I'm extraordinarily disappointed in global North countries, including mine. And we find ourselves in this absolutely catastrophic period where everything we seem to be doing is the very antithesis of solidarity. Not even performative solidarity is coming forth right now. Forget authentic or genuine solidarity. Not even performative solidarity is coming forth. Being where I am and quite close to the United States, I cannot tell you how bad things are. And if we don't begin by acknowledging the current world we live in, then I fear that these principles also become yet another aspirational wish list that we put out into the universe, and we hope somehow the world is going to get better. Please don't get me wrong. I want to see solidarity. I want to lead a life of solidarity, especially with global South colleagues and countries. But I'm most worried about our own governments. I'm worried about our own institutions. I'm not worried about people. My critique, as I'm going to explain it, is not about global North individuals. I'm talking about global North countries, governments, power systems that are currently engaged in absolutely devastating, insane policies that will not end well for all of us. So let's just recount some big fails of solidarity, if you wish. The first part of what I'm going to speak about will be depressing as hell. And I think we need to begin there because there is no way to come out of it if we don't start with reality. The biggest fail, in my opinion, catastrophic fail that probably led to millions of lives lost is the COVID vaccine inequity, which I think Caesar already mentioned. And that continued on with all of the opposition to the pandemic accord and the equity clauses in the pandemic accord, which is still not settled. Number two, I think massive failure of solidarity is Gaza. I think global health failed in Gaza. and continues to fail now in Iran, in Lebanon, in DRC, in Sudan, you name it. We are failing all over the place in terms of wars and conflicts. The collapse of aid, with the biggest aid cuts in the history of G7 countries, including aid cut by my country, is another failure of solidarity. Our inability to acknowledge, when I say our, I'm talking about the global north now, our inability to acknowledge that we caused the climate crisis. We are worsening the climate crisis right now with wars, with oil and chasing after fossil fuels, climate denialism that is now front and center in everything we are doing, and our inability to acknowledge that we owe reparations to the global south countries that did not cause the climate damage. All of this are massive looming failures of global solidarity, especially by the global north. Now, what do I see as the biggest threats to solidarity in the global north? To me, the single biggest problem is the rapid erosion of democracies. To me, democracy is fundamental for solidarity, because if you are authoritarian, if you are autocratic, then you have already decided that you will not stand in solidarity with others, because you're an autocrat. You can do whatever the hell you want, that you will not listen to people, that you will not follow the will of the people, you will not build consensus, you will not build relationships and networks. So it's no surprise that as democracy is waning and autocracy is rising, what are we seeing? Extraordinary right-wing populism. It is a right-wing populist who will say, why are you giving our money to some poor country far away? Why are you allowing people to enter our borders? All the othering that we are seeing, that these are aliens. They need to be thrown out of the country. We need to do mass deportations. We need to throw people out. We need to even kill people because they are in our country. The anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-women policies, anti-DEI policies, anti-trans LGBTQI, all follows that same far-right populist thinking and ideologies that is rapidly percolating, backed by autocrats, backed by oligarchs, backed by broligarchs and the tech bros. And that results in war, genocides, land grab, oil grab, all of the neo-colonial features of leaderships that we are seeing right now. We will just take another country. We will just invade another country. We will just take their oil. We will sell their oil. All of this results in an environment where solidarity is virtually impossible to even imagine right now. We're not even standing in solidarity with our own people, for God's sakes. How are we going to stand in solidarity with people far, far away? How? We're killing our own citizens literally on our streets, people who are standing up for the right things. I don't know in this environment what solidarity actually means. We've rejected reparations. We are in complete denial of climate change. So I'm struggling. I'm genuinely struggling what global north countries are doing and how far we have fallen. It's absolutely devastating for the whole world. It isn't just bad for us, it's bad for the entire planet, I would think. Now, I want to end by pulling us out of this depressive loop that I'm on right now and ask myself in this environment, where will hope come from? What does examples of solidarity look like? Firstly, I think we should not forget that people in the past, I'm talking about civil rights movements, anti-colonial struggles, I'm talking about women's suffragette movements, I'm talking about the AIDS movements. All of those movements at one point looked impossible, but people went and found ways to support each other and found ways to emancipate themselves. So I would say we should not forget that people have faced really dark times in the past and come out of it. So learning from those previous movements, I think, is critical for us. Number two, part of me wants to say, forget the global north. The global north is irredeemable at this point. I mean, look at the global north. They couldn't even bring themselves to acknowledge that slavery was a crime. And when the UN resolution was passed, the countries that either voted against it or abstained it were all countries that benefited from slavery and colonialism. That's where global North countries are. They can't even acknowledge what they've done. So part of me wants to say, forget the global North. Real future of global health lies in global South leadership, global South self-reliance, and global South-South solidarity. That is where the power needs to rest. That is where the action is. That is where the hope is. That is where the potential is. So when Africa CDC says we're going to manufacture our own vaccines, it brings me enormous hope because that's the future. Waiting for charity from the global North is not the future. So part of me wants to say global South leadership, South-South solidarity is where solidarity really needs to show up in a big way. At the same time, I don't think global North can be given a free pass. Global North is responsible for past and ongoing damages. And therefore, people like me in the global North, we need to hold our governments accountable. So when people are on the streets of Minneapolis protesting against ICE, or when people are trying hard to prevent or to reclaim the democracies, when people are standing up for science in the global North, people are doing anti-war protests here in the global North, that gives me hope. So for people like me, privileged elite in the global North, we have heck of a lot of work to do to convince our own leaders that solidarity is our path forward. That's our battle to fight. But while we're doing all these battles in the global North, I really hope global South countries will take this catastrophic movement and convert it into a hopeful path of self-reliance, agency, self-determination, and South-South solidarity. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Pai, Professor Pai. This has been quite inspiring. And I mean, hey, you've said some very hard things, but it is good and it is important that we face the reality of the world we live in. But then I'm also, grateful to you for pointing out the rays. There may just be little rays of hope. And yeah, history teaches us. Those who know me know that I like to read history. And sometimes I just console myself these days by reading St. Augustine, who lived through the fall of the Roman Empire. And at the same time was able to sort of like think about looking forward. And sometimes we need to, stand up. And this is where I think solidarity, like you say, is important, even amongst people in the global North, people like yourself, coming together. And yeah, and it's always about solving problems of people far away, but also looking in-house. And I think that's important. So with that, I'll hand over to Julia. Julia from the Equity unit at the Wellcome Trust or Wellcome, and with a lot of experience too on the international scene. Julia, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to join this conversation. I think, Professor Pai, thank you for just illustrating just how deep the real strain is we have at the moment in the global health landscape, with the deep funding cuts, the geopolitical uncertainty, and some really fundamental questions about how a health system is organized, whose priorities shape it, and how sustainable it is. And I can't attempt to answer those questions. And what I'll do instead is reflect on Wellcome, how we are, if you like, trying to embed principles, really coming from our equity framework and equity approach, but really seeing how we can approach those principles and some of the practical ways that comes through. And then I'd like to talk about one of the ways in which we're engaging with the global health landscape at the moment, because I think it might echo that sentiment and hope, I think, that Dr. Pai spoke about. And then just to conclude how we might engage on the principles of solidarity. So for those that might be less familiar with Wellcome, Wellcome's an independent global philanthropy. So our mandate is around improving health for all through science. And our role, therefore, in the health system is quite particular. We're not implementers and we're not government. We have funding, independence, and we're able to work catalytically. So it means that, where we can work, our contribution is less about scale, and recognizing that no single funder or organization can currently step into the gaps that we're facing in the global health financing. And it's more about how we can support knowledge and institutions and partnerships. And that's what our strategy and approach is about, combining research, influence, and engagement. We work globally with a particular focus in the UK and in low and middle income countries in Africa, South and Southeast Asia. We have a new equity framework, and actually underpinned by a new department, which is working right across everything that Wellcome is doing. And that really asks us to pay attention to who's leading the science that we fund, who is able to participate, and who ultimately is benefiting from it. So across our portfolio, we're increasingly attentive to questions of legitimacy and effectiveness, including the equity of the research ecosystem itself. So whether knowledge is trusted and usable and relevant in its context, whether decision-making, leadership, and capabilities sit where the impact is intended, whether communities and partners can participate meaningfully rather than tokenistically, and whether the benefits of research flow to those whose lives is meant to improve. So what does that mean in the practice of what we do? And again, I'm just going to echo, we don't have the answers to everything, and we certainly are in a learning space and keen to reflect on how we are working. So we fund in discovery research because it's foundational to the progress in health and futures. But we also work in solutions type research on urgent health challenges from mental health, infectious diseases, and climate and health. And that's where we very much connect the research with policy engagement, partnerships, and community engagement in many, many forms, including those with lived experience. Really so that we can take that research into evidence that can be more effectively put into use. So, and across all of what we're doing and the grants that we work with, we're paying very close attention to how we're engaging people and communities, recognizing that it will only have impact when it's relevant in its context and it's trusted by those whose lives it's seeking to improve. So you'll see, hopefully, you'll see those principles coming through in the very practical way in which Wellcome grants funding, the guidance that's embedded on equitable partnerships, on community engagements, and on an enabling research culture. The equity framework that we have is also asking us to look more broadly beyond the grants to equitable research ecosystems. And that really means that in practice, this is investing more in collaborative approaches, shared platforms, connections across geographies and in networks, not as ends in themselves, but as ways in strengthening the links between the science and the ecosystem and change. And just some practical examples of that. We work in Africa and Southeast Asia and India with funders who are based in those regions, really so that the decisions on the priorities are not taken, if you like, by Wellcome sitting in London, but actually that those decisions and the priorities are informed locally, and that therefore the priorities of those regions are being reflected. We also increasingly work with others through partnerships and platforms, not because projects are not important, because quite often working with others are better suited to sustainability, shaping agendas and supporting collective work. And I'll give an example of that. Wellcome has just recently joined an initiative that works with the science granting councils in Africa around their priorities. So this is a way in which we're looking to the future of science investment by governments and how we partner with that. So really, just to give you the example about an area of work that Wellcome is really engaging with, which I think speaks to this question of solidarity and particularly the challenges of the global health system. And that's in the follow-up to the Lusaka agenda. And here, Wellcome has, if you like, as a philanthropic funder, has been supporting regional dialogues around what is the way forward, given the crisis that we're looking at in the global health system. And so across the regions where we have convened these meetings as a shared space for others, particularly country and regional leaders, to try and surface what needs to change, what needs to be protected, and what different actors can contribute to this. We hope that we've used that convening to make sure that we have connected and amplified the voices of communities into that for us, so that, if you like, we really are trying to connect and identify how to move forward. And this is about how, if you like, the system needs to respond to the global south, how agendas need to be set by countries, be regionally connected, and then supported through an enabling global system. The whole agenda, of course, as we start to talk to others, means that we also have to ask questions of ourselves internally about our own practices, our incentives, and how we live up to those principles as we go forward. So we're coming to this conversation on solidarity, wanting to engage and to learn and play our part as a funder in this system. And there are some of the solidarity principles which really resonate, I think, well with that. How do we come to that as a funder? In the principles, Cesar, that you've outlined, and it says solidarity arises against the background of and is then maintained by trust, understood as the confidence to rely on one another across unequal positions with a specific common goal. And it involves us trusting all actors to do their part by recognizing that responsibilities differ over context and time, but actually it's that coming together with trust that we need to work through. So thank you for the opportunity to engage in the conversation, to reflect on our own practices, but also to see in what ways we might join in the allyship. I think Professor Pai talked about in taking forward the global health system.
Thanks very much, Julia. That was wonderful. I'm glad to see how Wellcome is also, trying to put some of these principles by listening and creating this network for priorities to be set regionally and funding to be sort of like decentralized in some way in the way it's done. I think this is very important. And also the aspect of listening to communities. So, Dulcis in Fondo, we'll now go on to hear Dr. Benjamin Djoudalbaye from the Africa CDC. You guys are at the heart of it all. Tell us what you think about the solidarity principles and how you see solidarity being enacted in the global health space. Over to you.
No, thank you very much, Prof. And it is really a pleasure on behalf of really Africa CDC and the Director General, who was supposed to be with you today, but for the other equally important engagement was not able to join us. But he has requested me to step in for him. Really, I wish to convey my appreciations to the organizers for convening this timely discussion. It is really, really a timely discussion. And I have seen from the two presentations that we have made and heard also from the other colleagues who have already spoken that we are meeting really at a very important moment for the global health, right? Solidarity, once largely aspirational, is now being embedded in global frameworks, including the pandemic agreement. So the challenge before us is to ensure that solidarity becomes operational, measurable, and sustained. That is very, very, very important. And you guys have done a lot of work, and I have seen for the past 2 to 3 years that we have heard directly from policymakers, from researchers, from the civil society. But these conversations have grounded our understanding of solidarity in a real world experience. So one message stand out from what I have heard from your two presentations, right? Solidarity must be built into systems before crises occur. It cannot be improvised during emergencies. In our context, as Africa CDC. So these discussions also have helped us, I think, to move from a broad commitment to more actionable principles. And we have seen the 8 principles that we have highlighted. But let me highlight a few. One, equity in access must be deliberately designed without a pre-agreed mechanism. Access to vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics will remain uneven, right? Solidarity requires predictable, transparent systems that ensure timely, fair access for all. Second, distributed capacity is essential to global health security. Africa's experience has shown that dependence on external supply chains creates systemic risks. Strengthening regional manufacturing, workforce capacity, and data system is not only a regional priority, it is a global public good. Third, solidarity must be grounded in mutual accountability. It is not charity, and someone also mentioned it already. It requires shared responsibility, trust, and transparency among all actors. Fourth, solidarity requires voice and agency. Those most affected must be meaningfully included in decision-making. This is essential for legitimacy and effectiveness. In this context, we welcome the inclusion of solidarity, in these global frameworks and also in the pandemic agreement. However, the true test will be in the implementation, translating the principles into practices. This will require clear governance, sustainable financing, and mechanisms for accountability. From the perspective of Africa CDC, we are working to operationalize solidarity through concrete initiatives, supporting food procurement, advancing regional manufacturing, and strengthening continental surveillance and data system sharing. Crucially, solidarity must reinforce regional institutions, which are central to delivering coordinated and context-responsive solutions. Looking ahead, we must move decisively from dialogue to implementation. This includes defining measurable indicators of solidarity, aligning, and this role really, I heard the colleague from Wellcome Trust mentioning the Lusaka agenda. The Lusaka agenda from our perspective is trying to address that one as well, aligning financing with agreed priorities and investing in systems that can deliver at scale. If solidarity is not shaped, it is to shape the future of the global health, it must be embedded in the architecture of our systems, not added in times of crisis. Africa CDC stands ready to work with all partners in advancing this shared agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Djoudalbaye. This has been amazing. I think the voice that is coming through is the idea of implementation and really translating these principles into tangible results. And also, I mean, the priorities of the Africa CDC and the solidaristic initiatives that are coming through within the Africa CDC. So now we're about to open the conversation to questions and answers with our panel members. So if you have questions, you can raise your hands. And while we're doing that, I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of two of our co-principal investigators on this call, Gabriela Arguedas from the University of Costa Rica, and then Elise Nouvet from Western University, Canada, who are also, and then many of our collaborators. And also, there are quite a number of people who have taken part in the workshops that we've done in India, in Ghana, in Australia not because it's too late in Australia, in India, who are also on this call. Just happy to see you all. So if I see there were some questions earlier, I could start with those. Is Dorcas Kamuya, Professor Dorcas had a question. If you want to ask, you can actually ask your question, Dorcas, directly. If you're still online. And I'm trying to find the question here. It's in the, yeah. The question says, how is solidarity experienced? Is it more visible when on a given issue or problem, one partner is more vulnerable than the other? Can solidarity be experienced when there is no need, right? Is the intention of solidarity, the solidarity principles, therefore, to spotlight areas that need this type of relationship and the appeal to humane sense making in our effort, in our response efforts? I think if the question is more about how we experience solidarity, and is it experienced only in times of need, or is it just an expression of our humane efforts? I don't know who wants to to start off with this question here. I know it can sound a bit abstract, but yeah, we could.
Maybe can I try?
Yes, please go ahead.
No, thank you. No, thank you so much. And that is a very really crucial, very important occasion. And in the past, we say, that is what I mentioned also, that solidarity, is aspirational. Everybody is talking about solidarity, but no one can tell you that what is solidarity exactly, especially when you look at this global health. We are in the context of a global health framework. What really solidarity means? When, for instance, you are denied access to vaccines, you are denied access. We have seen a lot of things during the COVID-19. I will give you an example. We were negotiating the vaccine for the African continent with companies, right? One of the companies that I'm not going to mention tell us that they are not going to sell to us, even if, regardless of the amount of the money that you are going to put down. You see? So, that is extremely hard, to hurt, so that is one. So what we want to see is solidarity should not be something that is selective. It should be embedded, in all the programs that we are doing. That is what is making the current discussions on the pandemic, pathogen access and benefit sharing very, very hard. It is very hard because the countries that have pathogens, they say, no, we cannot share it now today freely, because you take the pathogens, you develop diagnostic, therapeutics, vaccines, but you cannot access them. So what is now the essence of the solidarity? So when we are asking now, the exchange of, for instance, the IPs, the intellectual properties, to say, okay, please, can you just allow us to manufacture? Even that one, the answer is no. So if the solidarity is embedded, into these frameworks, at least we have some leverage. We can say, okay, this is really solidarity has, we want to see it. But it should not be something that is selective when there is a crisis. Some people access, the countermeasures, and the others don't access, That should not be the case. We should say, okay, we should reserve a certain percentage that should go to solidarity. Even if I'm doing business, even if I'm a pharmaceutical company, I should say, okay, let me reserve a certain percentage of what, I have for the solidarity. Because, we are just living in one world, and a public health threat somewhere is a public health threat everywhere. So you have to be very careful. You cannot say that, okay, you are far away, but today, these pathogens don't need visa or passport or whatever to fly. We are just one fly away from any public health threats. So let me pause there. Thank you.
So that's a very practical and answer to the question. Do any of the other panelists want to come in, or should we move to the other questions? I see Madhu and Julia nodding. Julia, yes.
I just wanted to support Dr. Benjamin. I think the crises give us the lessons that we need to reflect on. But I think then it's important that we take those principles through into everything we then do. Because I think, that whole way in which we're thinking about end-to-end vaccine development on the continent, there's so many pieces of that need to be thought through. But if we're thinking all the time about those solidarity principles, it might take a while, but actually then we're bringing that to bear in the day-to-day. So I just wanted to thank you for the practical example, because I think it really illustrates why this is needed.
Thanks, Julia. I see that Joseph de Guzman has quite a number of questions. The first one is, from a global health equity perspective, how can mechanisms like the medicines patent pool and the WHO pandemic agreement move beyond largely voluntary compliance to make sure that decision-making power, technology transfer, and access to life-saving medicines are genuinely centered on low and middle-income countries rather than still being shaped by the priorities of wealthier nations and pharmaceutical companies? I think that follows from the conversation we just had. How can we move beyond sort of like voluntary goodwill kind of, actions to ensuring that these ideals are actually demandable. We can actually demand them.
My my approach and work for the last several years has been to primarily focus on global South innovations and manufacturing. That is where I think the future lies. And Dr. Benjamin said that beautifully. In a recent piece we wrote, we gave so many examples where it is happening already and making a massive difference, right? So to me, relying on the global north is a very bad idea, and more so even in the pandemic, even in a catastrophic global crisis, we could not find a way to find equity or find options to make sure vaccine hoarding and things like that weren't happening. And I have a very low opinion of what might come out of all of that, but I have absolutely full confidence that global South countries are not only capable of innovating, they already are, they're also capable of manufacturing and delivering. So self-reliance and self-determination by the global South nations absolutely is critical. And South-South solidarity in whatever shape or form, transfer of technology, regional manufacturing, like what Africa CDC is planning, are all wonderful things that we should be investing our energy in. I'm not saying we should give up on the global north or pandemic accords or other things, but having seen what we've seen for the last 5-6 years, my hopes are dimming on that front, but my hopes are very bright for global South innovation, manufacturing, and delivery.
Thank you, Madhu. Michelle, I see you have your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of things. I agree with what Madhu has said, but I think if you've worked in infectious diseases, COVID was an acute example of a common problem. And, I think that when DNDi was set up, it was set up by research institutes in the South with MSF, because it was recognized that if you actually wanted to solve the problems, you had to work together. And I entirely agree with you that there is research. There always has been research capacity in the majority world. So the question is who has set those priorities and who has funded it? And I think that we haven't yet really resolved where the funding is coming from. I think that when we're talking about these approaches, I think that we shouldn't confuse solidarity with dependence. And I think that there is a kind of tension here. We were saying that solidarity is not a charity model. And I think that what I think some of the pandemic agreement and what my colleague from the Africa CDC is talking about and we share is that it's important to build up the capabilities, and it's not just manufacturing. I think we have a lot of focus on manufacturing, which is important, but in a number of areas. And if we're looking at the cuts that have been made in the US, particularly to basic science, we're not going to be having things to transfer in the future unless that research, that early stage research and the clinical research is also undertaken in countries in the South. And that's what we were trying to bring together with the Dengue Alliance. It's a South-South approach. That said, I do think, and science shows this, that there is still a need and a space to look at ways in which science and some of the progress of science can be shared between regions. And I think that the terms on which you do that are what's important. And I think that there are opportunities. It's easier to do it at an earlier stage than at a later stage, to build in those principles from the start, that you're not developing something just for the hell of it. It is that you are wanting to make sure that it's affordable and available. And I think that's one thing that I think is interesting that's come out of the pandemic agreement. I mean, it is a creature of compromise. It is not perfect. But I think one of the things that is interesting is that there was an acknowledgement for once that governments do have some power over how they use their public investments. And, if they are funding research, which a lot of them do or will do, they shouldn't just hand over those benefits to be privatized. I think there is a possibility to put conditions on that to ensure that kind of equity is built into this. And then I guess the final thing that I'd say about the pandemic agreement is I absolutely agree that it is a real example of the fact that, countries, particularly in the North, have really cut down any discussion about equity. But it is also an example of kind of what I was saying, is that people say multilateralism is failing when the rule shapers are faced with people who are challenging that. And I think that, we've seen leadership, I think, from the African Union and the group of equity within the pandemic agreement to turn around and say that they are not accepting the rules that are being put forward. And that is why we're at this impasse. And it will not be, and I don't know how it's gonna play out. I mean, we're gonna see the next discussion next week. But I think it's important to say that because the African group and others are holding on to this principle that they are not just going to trade away any of the advantage that they have, and that there has to be some reciprocity, that is why we're at this impasse. And for me, it doesn't mean that multilateralism isn't working. It means that multilateralism under the old rules is being challenged, and we'll have to see how that plays out.
Thank you, Michelle. I think this has been great. There's also a question here about how do we ensure that put guardrails so that the solidarity principles that we are proposing do not become another top-down framework, but instead reflects locally grounded priorities and values. And I mean, if I may come in myself a little bit there, we've really tried to listen a lot, to hear from the ground. And interestingly, one of the things that we keep seeing in global health, and I think, Benjamin and other speakers have mentioned this, solidarity among many peoples that we have engaged with in the global South, there's what we call the deep solidarity, which is the everyday solidarity that holds people together. And then we have the responsive solidarity, which arises when there are crises. But the thing about global health is that quite often countries are operating in silos, self-interested. And all of a sudden, when there is a crisis, you want to pull solidarity out of their heart. It's not there because your premises are not solidaristic. And so you're not going to get it. And I think, what we're seeing really now is that a lot of masks that existed in the past are now falling off. And we're seeing the crude and hard and even ugly face as it is. But this is also the time for us to stand in solidarity. I see, Madhu, you have your hand up here. Mm-hmm.
I think I'm starting to painfully learn a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, I genuinely think solidarity is impossible unless we fight for democracy, because it is the most fundamental thing. Because if you are not democratic, then you will not even acknowledge that there are people who have been denied equity or marginalized and therefore are in need of solidarity or allyship. The second painful realization is that we are failing on one of the most basic elements of human rights. You have to first and foremost respect a fellow human being, regardless of whether they have the right paperwork or not, or what their color is, what God they're praying. None of that should matter, right? And it's not just human rights, it's universality of human rights. That's where we are failing, right? It's not just human rights for ourselves, but it doesn't matter if the human rights is for somebody somewhere else. And you can see all the human rights violations that are happening right now, the anti-refugee, all of the mass deportations, everything that we are seeing now, not respecting sovereignty, invading other countries, bombing other countries. All of this fundamentally comes down to the point that you are not respecting all human beings as worthy, as having human rights. And so I have now come to a point where my global health course begins with a massive section on human rights, because that is the non-negotiable that we all have to agree on. That you're worthy, I'm worthy, you're a human, I'm a human. That's all I need to know about you. And therefore, you're worthy of healthcare, therefore, you're worthy of vaccines, you're worthy of medicines, you're worthy of everything else, right? So it is the erosion of human rights that is frightening right now, and that goes hand in hand with the erosion of democracy, right? So to me, we can't save global health without saving democracy. We can't save global health without fighting for human rights. So all of us in global health have no choice but to become pro-democracy. We have to be part of pro-democracy movements locally, nationally, wherever we are. Two, we all have to become parts of pro-human rights work. And that is something we in global health and development see as somebody else's business, that we are not centering it in our day-by-day practice, let alone in our classrooms. So this requires a lot of thinking, right? So I think global solidarity, we can't bypass these fundamental building blocks on which global solidarity rests. You can't somehow magically show solidarity with someone if you're not even respecting them as a fellow human being, is what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's very true. Solidarity, starts when you begin to identify with the other person, and that means you are recognizing their humanity. Absolutely. So I see we're running out of time. This conversation could have continued. We've had over 160 people stay online for 90 minutes from different parts of the world. So what I'm going to try to do now is, can I just ask each of our generous panelists who have been engaging with us so far, just to sort of like a brief thought before we then round up, please. I know there are some other questions, but we will not be able to address to take up all the questions. So in no particular order, I see Benjamin, you had your hand up first. Do you want to go? Yeah.
No, I had my hand up first because I saw a comment in French from a colleague from Mali, and I just wanted to respond in French to give him this right to say. And it will be my concluding word. I have seen. Ok, j'ai vu que les pays comme le Mali et le Sahel en général constatent malheureusement une diminution de l'aide. Mais l'aide publique au développement a baissé de 71% depuis 2021. Donc, c'est une situation globale. Mais cela ne veut pas dire que c'est parce qu'il y a des questions de sécurité au Mali et dans le Sahel que l'aide diminue. En fait, c'est une situation qui est globale. Ça, c'est la première réflexion. La deuxième réflexion, c'est quand on parle de solidarité. Demain, s'il y a une grave crise sanitaire au Mali, ou bien au Burkina, au Niger, ou n'importe où dans le Sahel, c'est pas ce qui fera en sorte que la communauté internationale ne se mobilisera pas aux côtés des pays là. D'accord? Donc, je l'avais déjà dit, une menace au Mali, c'est une menace n'importe où. Donc, la solidarité doit exister et c'est notre devoir de faire le plaidoyer pour que ces pays-là puissent, qu'on leur accorde l'attention qu'il leur est due. Merci. Thank you so much.
Right. Could you just summarize that in 1 or 2 sentences for those who didn't follow you in English, please?
Okay, no. I was saying that the reduction of the ODA is a general trend. It is not targeting countries like Mali or the state of the Sahelian, region, the Sahel region. It is a general trend. It is not because of the security issues there that the support is not coming, or the external aid the foreign aid is not coming. If today Mali or Burkina or any other country in that region faces a serious health crisis, the international community, will mobilize itself to join, them, because a threat in this region is threat anywhere else. So that is what I just want to reassure him, that it is not because of the security, but it is a general situation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thanks. Julia, do you want to come in?
Maybe just to reflect, because I think we talked about the vaccine equity and because it is a really good example of this, I think. So really about what solidarity means is that we embed the predictability and fairness in access. And I think, Michelle, you talked about the IP and making sure that we're starting from that very principle. We have shared governance and agenda setting from the countries of the South, so that it's not just consultation, it's about preparedness and working from country-led and then regionally embedded agendas. And I think, reflecting on Dr. Benjamin, I think regional capability in this is a public good. I think we have to start working together around that whole ecosystem to see, and even it's taking each part and bringing those principles of solidarity as we start to work together. I mean, the fact that we're all sitting together now says that there are, our institutions have an agenda here that we can come together on. So it's in how do we start to embed these principles going forward, even if it's not on everything, even if we start saying, of this deal, this much we need to make sure is starting to progress this agenda as we see it, this end-to-end regionally led ecosystem. I will end there.
All right. Thank you, Julia. And Michelle?
So I think that, I'd echo what other people said. I mean, Madhu is absolutely right that we operate in a broader context. And I would add to that is not just the political context and human rights, but the economic context and we need to be aware of that. But I think also there is the question as a practical organization that is trying to develop things is what can you do as an individual or an institution to embed solidarity. I think principles only matter if they change outcomes. And I think that we have some examples here of how that can be done, and also Madhu made the point, and I absolutely agree with this, that change doesn't always come from above. Most of the change in global health has come from people and institutions working together. And so I think that there is also an important role for organizations and individuals to look at ways in which we can find a space, and for us in relation to treatments, it's about, can we create places where you are looking at knowledge and science as a common good, and how can we embed that? And I think that there are opportunities even in a difficult environment.
Thank you, Michelle. And finally, Madhu, the last minute to you.
Thank you. I just want to kind of say that not only do we need to be in solidarity with our fellow human beings, regardless of who they are, where they are, what they look like, what God they pray to, we also need to stand in solidarity with unborn generations, right? If we don't act on climate change right now, I don't know what our grandkids will inherit from us. So all of the climate change denial now that's like gone gangbusters, and we are willing to spend billion a day on war and bombs, and we don't have money for climate action or for healthcare or whatever, right? So that's where we are. So I'm deeply concerned for the future of humankind because of how inward looking and short sighted we have become as a species, right? And maybe humans going extinct is not a bad thing because 99% of living beings on this planet have gone extinct. So, but I would be very sad if we became extinct because of stupid toxic men rather than something like a plague or an asteroid hitting us. Regardless, I think our solidarity is not just starts with our fellow human beings, but it needs to widen to include all living things, plants, animals, ecosystems, and the health of the planet, right? So we have a broader stewardship agenda. And right now, everything we are seeing is almost the opposite of that, right? So if I were to say one last word, I would say solidarity is under attack in an unprecedented way right now. And I think at a minimum, we need to show solidarity with our fellow human beings, even if they are in our own neighborhood, our own colleagues who are Black, Brown, Indigenous, women, trans, LGBTQI, Muslim, Jews. We need to start at that fundamental human level of showing solidarity or being good allies to them. And then it percolates to what we can do at a broader level to all creatures, planet, so on and so forth. So even if our governments are depressing, I don't think I'm giving up on myself. I can do something right now without the permission of my government, right? I can be a good ally. I can be in solidarity with groups. I don't need anybody's permission. At a personal level, we can all make progress right now, this minute if we decided to. It's the collective struggle that requires enormous amount of work, especially given what we are facing in the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that leaves us at a very good note. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, sometimes people ask questions that are a luxury, whether academics or whatever should also be activists. But in times like this, whatever we do becomes a form of activism if we take these things seriously. And that is how we bring about change. So thank you all, panelists, and I'll hand over to Julian to conclude the open forum then. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you to all our panelists today. You've done an excellent job. I don't think it was easy to kickstart this whole discussion with the principles, but yeah, luckily everyone now has the principles in the chat. We have the link to the report, so you can now start to read the principles and see how we can continue this conversation, because like we've agreed in the chat, we see that these conversations are needed. More of these conversations will be important to see how practical we can bring solidarity to our networks, our systems, and embed it in our structures. So the link to the report is in the chat. It's also on our website. And also upcoming is our feedback webinars. We're going to still take these principles to the different regions and in different languages. So next up is going to be our webinar in June, and we'll be communicating the date very soon. It will be in English for those Anglophone speakers. We're going to be presenting and discussing the principles again. Now, this time we have workshop participants who were there, people who participated in the interviews. And now that you have a copy, we also hope that you can join us and make this conversation more real. And we find ways of making it more practical in our own areas. So I don't intend to give another whole talk because we are out of time, but I'm really grateful for all of you, to our speakers, to all of you who have attended as well and connected with us and engaged us with the questions and comments. It's beautiful to see such conversations taking place, and we hope that you can keep joining this space. Let's own it and make our lives, better. Let's be in solidarity and take charge. I will leave you with that. And I hope that we will be able to meet again.